When I was 15 years old and a sophomore in high school, the most terrifying day of my life happened. It was a typical school day, seemingly no different from any other. I recall sitting in my algebra class, which I believe was the third session of the day. That's when someone arrived at the classroom door with a message. At our school, we had a system where students would assist in the office during certain hours, delivering notifications to other students. These messages were usually about students needing to exit the school for various reasons, such as medical checkups or similar matters. When the student reached my class, they handed the note to my teacher. He read it and then called out my name. I was taken aback because I wasn't expecting any reason to depart from school that day. I pondered if I'd forgotten about a doctor's appointment, but my dad hadn't mentioned anything, and I know he would have. When my name was announced, I glanced around and then stood up, slowly walking to my teacher. He told me to take care and handed me the homework assignment. I took the note, which also functioned as a hall pass, and exited the classroom. I remember that's when I first read the message. It stated something to the effect of, "I'll be there to pick you up for your appointment at 11:15. Dad." I supposed I had some sort of appointment. It just felt a bit odd to me. Still, I guess I was pleased to be leaving school. I strolled through the vacant corridors, making my way to the side entrance. There was a parking area there, which is where students would get picked up by their parents. I reached the doors and stepped outside into the parking lot. There I noticed a car, but it wasn't my father's vehicle. It was a different make and color. I figured it belonged to someone else's parent, and my father wasn't there yet. The time was not quite 11:15, but I think it was around 10 past 11 or so. I don't remember precisely. I stood there scanning the area, waiting for my father to arrive, and then I saw the car that was parked there with the engine running, and the front passenger's window began to lower. I looked and saw a man turn his head and look at me. We made eye contact, and I could tell he was about to speak. The man said he was there to pick me up, and my father had asked him to. He then mentioned that he was a friend of my father. I had never seen this man before in my life, and while I may not have been the sharpest student in the school, I certainly wasn't that naive. I was extremely wary. I asked the man how exactly he knew my father, and he responded by saying they were old acquaintances. I then informed the man that I didn't feel at ease going with him, and I was returning to the school. The man tried to persuade me to just get in the car, but I turned around to head back into the school. This situation was starting to feel really suspicious. The problem was, when I got back to the side doors of the school, they wouldn't budge. The doors were secured. I had forgotten that all entrances to the school were locked during school hours, except for the front main entrance. Then, things deteriorated. I looked back to the car to see the driver's door open. The man emerged and started approaching me. The car was maybe 60 feet away at this point, as I stood right outside of the side doors to the school. I felt like my only choice was to flee. I turned and sprinted around to the front side of the school. I didn't bother to look back at all to see if I was being pursued. Back then, I could run quite swiftly, and fortunately, I made it around to the front end of the school pretty rapidly. I kept running until I reached the front doors, and then I walked inside. When you first entered the front doors at the school, there was a small window where a man sat during school hours. He would inquire who you were, and you had to show him your student ID. He asked for my ID, and as I retrieved it, I attempted to explain what had just occurred. I must not have articulated it very well, though, because he seemed quite perplexed, and to be honest, the whole situation was pretty baffling. I got a hall pass from my father to leave school for an appointment that I didn't know about. Then my father wasn't there, but another man was, and asked me to go with him. Believe me, I was just as confused as he was. After verifying my school ID, the man at the window wrote me a pass to return to my algebra class, and I was on my way. I walked through the empty hallways of the school back to class. This was just about 10 to 20 minutes after I had originally left. I walked back in. My teacher was lecturing, and there was a presentation that was paused on the board. I remember it was incredibly awkward walking into the middle of class. Everybody was staring at me. They, as well as the teacher, were probably all really bewildered seeing me return so soon after I had left. I explained that there had been some confusion, and I didn't need to leave. Then I sat back down at my desk, and the lesson continued. Barely 5 minutes had passed when the intercom suddenly broadcast an announcement. The principal's voice, sounding unusually stern, informed us that we were going into an immediate lockdown. He emphasized that this was not a drill. Our teacher seemed visibly worried as he instructed us to leave our desks and sit quietly on the floor at the back of the classroom. We complied quickly, confusion and concern spreading among us. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, suddenly wondering if this had anything to do with what had just happened to me. The lockdown continued for about 30 minutes. The room was eerily silent, with most of us too anxious to whisper or speculate. Finally, the intercom crackled with another announcement. We all fell silent, straining to hear. The principal's voice, noticeably relieved this time, informed us that the lockdown had been lifted. There was a collective sigh of relief, but the atmosphere remained tense as we slowly returned to our seats. As we were dismissed from class, snippets of information began to circulate. I soon learned the reason for the lockdown. A man had entered the school, completely disregarding the ID check at the front desk. He had pushed past the man at the window without a word and disappeared into the hallways. The staff had no choice but to initiate a lockdown until the intruder could be found. It took the entire duration of the lockdown to locate him. The police were called in, and they eventually found him concealed in a storage closet on the second floor. The most chilling part is that it was the same man who had been in the car trying to pick me up earlier. This incident remains the most terrifying thing to ever happen to me. The man must have somehow created the note for me and tried to get me to leave the school. Who he was and how he found me, I truly have no idea. It really unnerves me to think about that part. Thankfully, nothing like that has ever occurred again. This was the scariest day of my life. I was in 11th grade. It was a normal Tuesday, and I was sitting in chemistry class before lunch. Our teacher was going on about molecular structures or something, but I wasn't really paying much attention. I was more focused on the clock, counting down the minutes until lunch. Suddenly, the intercom came to life. Usually, announcements came at the beginning or end of the day, so this was unusual. The principal's voice came through, sounding tense. He told us we were going into an immediate lockdown and that this was not a drill. My heart started racing. Our teacher quickly locked the door and told us to get away from the windows. We huddled in the corner of the room, trying to stay quiet. Nobody knew what was going on, but you could feel the fear in the air. Some of my classmates were whispering, asking if anyone knew anything. I checked my phone, but there were no messages or news alerts. Minutes felt like hours as we sat there in silence. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The girl next to me was shaking, and I noticed a few others were silently crying. Our teacher kept glancing at the door, his face pale and worried. After about 15 minutes, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, slow footsteps. The footsteps stopped right outside our classroom door. We all held our breath. The door handle jiggled. Once, twice. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I grabbed the hand of the person next to me, not even sure who it was. The handle jiggled again, more forcefully this time. After a while, the footsteps moved on. I could hear a few of my classmates quietly sobbing. We sat there, frozen in fear. Every little sound made us jump. The tick of the clock on the wall, the muffled sobs of my classmates, the distant sound of sirens growing louder. Another 20 minutes passed in tense silence. Then, we heard more footsteps. Multiple sets moving quickly. Voices, too. I thought at the time that it was probably police officers. One of them tried our door, then moved on when they found it locked. A few minutes later, the intercom came on again. The principal announced that the lockdown was over and that we should remain in our classrooms until further instructions were given. There was a collective sigh of relief, but the tension didn't fully dissipate. Our teacher tried to calm us down, saying everything was okay now. But his voice was shaky, and I could tell he was just as scared as we were. Some of my classmates started to talk, their voices a mix of fear and relief. Others just sat there, still in shock. About 30 minutes later, we were told to evacuate the building. As we filed out, I saw police officers everywhere. They were in the hallways, classrooms, even on the roof. Their presence was both reassuring and terrifying. What had happened to require so many officers? They directed us to the football field, where we sat in the bleachers while they took attendance, and parents started arriving to pick up their kids. The sun was bright, a stark contrast to the darkness of fear we'd just experienced inside. That's when the rumors started flying. Someone said they saw a man with a gun. Another person claimed there were multiple intruders. A girl in my math class swore she heard gunshots, but I hadn't heard anything like that. Everyone had a different story, and it was hard to know what to believe. I saw some of my friends from other classes and waved them over. We huddled together, sharing our experiences. My friend Jake said he'd been in the bathroom when the lockdown was announced. He'd had to hide in a stall, his feet up on the toilet so no one could see him. The fear in his eyes as he told the story made it all feel real again. As we sat on the bleachers, I noticed a commotion near the school building. Several police officers were escorting a man in handcuffs. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. The man looked around wildly as they led him to a police car. For a moment, his eyes seemed to lock with mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Who was he? What had he been planning to do? The principal came to address us, his face grim. He explained that an armed man had entered the school, but had been apprehended without any shots fired. We were all to go home for the day, and school would be closed tomorrow. As I waited for my parents to pick me up, I couldn't shake the image of that man. Had he really been right outside our classroom door? What would have happened if he'd managed to get in? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I saw some teachers huddled together, talking in low voices. They looked shaken, and I realized they must have been just as scared as we were. Our chemistry teacher was among them, and when he saw me looking, he gave a weak smile and a nod. My parents finally arrived, looking frantic. They rushed over and hugged me tightly. I could see other parents doing the same with their kids. Some were crying, others looked angry, demanding answers from any school official they could find. As we walked to the car, I took one last look at the school. Police tape was everywhere, and officers were still going in and out. It looked like a scene from a crime show, not the place where I'd spent the last 3 years of my life. The day that had started so normally had turned into something out of a nightmare. As we drove home, I knew it would be a long time before any of us felt truly safe at school again. I'm a high school physics teacher with a classroom on the ground floor. My room is filled with various experiments and demonstrations to engage students in the wonders of science. From pendulums to circuit boards, every corner is designed to spark curiosity. I find great joy in helping teenagers grasp complex concepts and see the world through the lens of physics. It was a chilly Wednesday morning during second period. I had a free block and was using the time to set up a pendulum experiment for my next class. The halls were quiet, with most students settled into their classrooms. Around 9:45 a.m., the intercom came to life, announcing we were going into lockdown. The principal instructed all staff and students to follow lockdown procedures immediately. My heart skipped a beat as I processed the information. Following protocol, I immediately locked the door and turned off the lights. I'd already lowered the blinds earlier to block out the glare on the smartboard, which now seemed like a fortunate coincidence. As silence fell over the school, I wondered about the cause of the lockdown, hoping everyone was safe. I moved quietly to my desk in the far corner of the room, trying to make sense of the situation. Were we dealing with an external threat? Or was it something within the school? The uncertainty was unsettling. For several minutes, nothing seemed amiss. The silence was almost oppressive. Then, as I sat at my desk, I heard a faint sound. It was barely perceptible at first, but it grew clearer. Something was happening outside. Cautiously, I moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the blinds. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was movement in the parking lot. A figure was moving between cars, clearly trying to stay hidden. They moved from one vehicle to another, always keeping in the shadows. My heart rate picked up as I realized this could be the reason for our lockdown. The person appeared to be an adult, likely male, dressed in dark clothing that blended with the shadows. As I watched, he made his way towards the school building. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered something crucial. In my rush to start setting up the experiment, I'd cracked open one of the windows for some fresh air. It was on the opposite side of the room, and I knew I couldn't risk crossing the space to close it now. The open window suddenly felt like a glaring vulnerability in the otherwise secure classroom. I held my breath, realizing with growing dread that the open window could provide an easy entry point for the intruder. But then, to my horror, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my classroom. They were slow, methodical, as if someone was trying not to be heard. Each step seemed to echo in the silent corridor, growing louder as they approached. Acting on instinct, I ducked behind my desk, wedging myself into the knee hole. The solid wood sides offered some concealment, but I knew I was far from safe. My mind raced, trying to think of a better hiding spot, but I was afraid any movement would give me away. Time seemed to crawl as I strained my ears, trying to track the intruder's movements. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I heard the handle rattling. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would give me away, but thankfully, the door was locked. My relief was short-lived. To my absolute horror, I heard a key slide into the lock. As a teacher, I knew only staff and security should have keys to the classrooms. Who could this be? The door slowly opened, the hinges creaking slightly. I could hear someone moving around the room, their footsteps muffled on the carpeted floor. They seemed to be searching for something, opening cabinets and drawers. My mind raced, trying to understand what they could be looking for in a physics classroom. The intruder's movements brought them closer to my hiding spot. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look behind the desk. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to spring into action if discovered. Just then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I'd forgotten to silence it. The sound, though brief, seemed deafening in the quiet room. The footsteps abruptly stopped. I could almost feel the intruder's attention zeroing in on my location. In a moment of panic, I decided to make a run for it. It was a risky move, but staying hidden no longer felt like an option. I burst out from behind the desk, startling the intruder. In the dim light filtering through the blinds, I could see it was a young man in a dark hoodie, his face partially obscured. He lunged for me, his hand reaching out to grab my arm. I managed to dodge, my heart pounding in my ears. I sprinted for the door, knocking over a chair in my haste. I could hear the man's heavy footsteps right behind me. I raced down the hallway. Every sound seemed amplified in the empty corridor. I headed for the main entrance. As I neared the front doors, I saw a ray of hope. A security guard was just entering the building, alerted by the commotion. I shouted for help, pointing behind me to indicate the threat. The guard's eyes widened as he took in the situation, and he immediately radioed for backup. The intruder, seeing the guard, turned around and ran back. More security personnel arrived within minutes. a thorough search of the building was conducted. After about 20 minutes, they found the man trying to escape through a fire exit and apprehended him. The sense of relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I found myself shaking, the full impact of what had happened hitting me. The police arrived soon after, and I gave my statement, still trying to process the events. The lockdown was lifted about an hour later. While shaken, I was relieved that no one had been hurt. The principal held an assembly to address the students and staff, assuring us that security measures would be reviewed and enhanced. It turned out the intruder was a former student who had been struggling with severe mental health issues. He had broken into the school during a psychotic episode, with no clear motive or plan. His erratic behavior and lack of clear purpose made the situation even more unsettling. Thankfully, he was unarmed. The familiarity of the intruder somehow made the experience even more unsettling. Back in the late 90s, when I was 14 years old and a freshman in high school, something happened that I'll never forget. I was hanging out with some friends before class started, just talking about random stuff that 14-year-olds talk about. Then the warning bell rang, and we all had to go to our classes. I took my time getting to my class, because my teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was pretty chill and didn't care if you were a little late. She usually started class a few minutes late anyway, because she was always busy with drama club stuff. As I was walking to class, the school bell rang again, meaning school was starting and I'd be late. But I didn't really care, and just kept walking. The hallways were empty now. Then the intercom came on, saying the school was going into lockdown. I was really confused because everything seemed fine to me. I kept walking to my classroom, thinking it might just be a drill or something. When I got to the hallway where my classroom was, I stopped dead in my tracks. At the end of the hallway, there was this big guy wearing a bright orange hunting vest and camo pants. He had on combat boots and was carrying this huge olive green duffel bag. It took me a second to realize what was happening. The guy hadn't seen me yet, but then he turned and looked my way. I quickly ducked back around the corner, freaking out. He was standing right by my classroom, so I couldn't go there now. The hallways were totally empty, and I started to panic. I knew the school pretty well, so I went to the closest place I could think of, which was the janitor's closet. I was hoping I could hide there until everything was over. I sat in there trying to listen for any sounds, praying the guy wouldn't come in. I was terrified the whole time and didn't make a sound. I stayed in that closet, trying not to freak out completely, for maybe about 45 minutes. It was super quiet, and I couldn't hear much, but at one point, I did hear footsteps, and it really scared me. I had no idea who it was, but luckily they walked past, and then it was quiet again. I just hoped that guy I saw wouldn't come into the closet. Finally, I decided to leave. I hadn't heard anything in forever, so I thought it might be safer to get out of there. I stepped out, and the hallways were still empty and quiet. The lockdown was still going on, and I had no clue what was happening. I started walking really fast back to my classroom, being super careful and looking around everywhere. I was about halfway there when I heard a noise that made me freeze. It was footsteps coming from the next hallway around the corner. It was happening all over again. I felt that same fear and shock hit me. I turned around fast and went down another hallway, trying to avoid whoever was coming. I looked back for a split second and saw the guy in the orange vest starting to come around the corner. At that point, I swear I could have outrun a cheetah. For the first time in my life, I was seriously running for my life, and nothing else mattered. It was like time slowed down and my senses went into overdrive. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel every breath burning in my lungs, and see every detail of the hallway with crystal clarity. My mind was completely blank except for one thought: keep moving. I just kept running. Eventually, I stopped because I couldn't hear the guy behind me anymore. I caught my breath and started walking towards the exit, hoping to find a way out. When I got to the main doors, I saw a bunch of cop cars outside. My legs felt like jelly. This officer spotted me and waved me over. I just stumbled out and sat on the curb, trying to catch my breath. They told us later they caught the guy, but we never found out why he did it. After that, things were pretty rough for a while. I had trouble sleeping and kept jumping at every little noise. My parents found this group for kids who'd been through scary stuff like that. It helped, I guess, but it took a long time to feel normal again. It's been like 24 years now. The school changed a lot after it happened. They put in metal detectors at the entrances and hired more security guards. It was weird at first, but we got used to it. Every time I hear about a school shooting or lockdowns on the news, it hits me real hard. My heart races, and for a moment, I'm right back in that hallway, scared out of my mind. It's like reliving it all over again. What really gets to me, though, is how these incidents get turned into political arguments. People start debating gun laws or mental health policies before the victims' families have even had time to grieve. It makes me so angry. They have no idea what it's like to be in that situation, to feel that fear. I just wish they'd focus on helping the people affected instead of scoring political points. I'm just glad no one got hurt that day at my school. But man, going through something like that, it really messes with your head. I wouldn't want anyone to have to deal with that, ever. And I really hope someday we can figure out how to stop these things from happening, politics aside.